Hey there, so today I actually managed to get my hands on the Beelink SER5 Max. Now what makes this system special is the fact that it's coming with a Ryzen 7 5800H. The interesting part about this system in particular is that it comes with a stock TDP of 54 watts. Now, Beelink has had different versions of the SRE5 with a wide variety of different CPU combinations, and they've even already had one with the 5800H, but the stock TDP of those was anywhere between 35 to 45 watts. This time around, they are pumping a full 54 watts through this system, and what that means is that both the CPU and GPU have quite a lot of power to work with here. Of course, if you've seen any of the other videos that I've done about testing TDP, you know that there is diminishing returns to TDP. So we're definitely going to have to test this out and compare it to other systems with a wide range of different TDPs. But for right now, we're just going to get the first impressions that we get out of this system. One thing I do want to point out though is just how similar this system is to the Beelink SER6 with the Ryzen 5 6600H. It's definitely an interesting point of comparison because they are very similar in price to each other, but one is an 8-core 16-thread CPU while the other one is a 6-core 12-thread, but the GPU difference between the two of them is the biggest differentiating factor. But we'll be comparing those two later on. In general, this is a pretty standard Beelink construction, and I'm overall happy with it. I don't really have much to complain about. It seems that with each iteration of the SER series, Beelink has pretty much just been making small quality of life improvements that have over time really led to all around nicer package. The biggest addition here being the fact that they replaced one of the HDMI ports with a display port, which I personally find to be a welcome addition. But let's jump right on into some performance numbers, and the first thing we're going to be taking a look at is the CPU. So we're taking a look at Cinebench R23. Now in R23, the 5800H is giving us a multi-core score of 11,848. In general, this is a pretty impressive leap in terms of the overall performance that we've seen out of most of the mini PCs. Its closest counterpart being the SER6 with the Ryzen 5 6600H, but that ended up getting us a score of 8,981. Cinebench and all of the different CPU tests seem to be the things that benefit the most from the increased TDP, which makes sense because of the fact that the GPU itself, at the end of the day, still only has 8 cores and is only clocked to 2000 megahertz. So the extra TDP is really not going to be doing much there at all because once the GPU reaches its max clock speed, it's not going to use any more power because it can't really do much of anything else. The CPU, on the other hand, we're talking about 8 full CPU cores that need to be fed, and they are trying to reach some pretty high clock speeds, so they are more than happy to eat up all of that extra power. And it really shows in the overall multi-core test results. As a point of comparison, the Ryzen 9 3900X on my desktop computer that I actually use for my day-to-day video editing and such ends up getting a multi-core score of 17,746. So this Ryzen 7 is actually not that far off from the result there. Of course, things also get interesting if we look at the single core scores, where the 5800H actually ends up being towards the top of the stack but is still beaten out by the 6600H. That being said though, it does actually manage to beat out all of the different Ryzen 5 systems except for the 6600H also beats out the single core performance of my 3900X on my desktop. It makes sense at this point. It is quite a few years old and quite a few Zen generations behind, and its biggest advantage is really just the fact that it has those 12 full cores. But the IPC increases that we've gotten over the years have slowly been pushing these lower core count CPUs towards being very, very competitive. I did also run through the Mark Time Spy on here, and that gave us a Time Spy score of 1,627 with a CPU score of 8,320 in particular. And of course, our graphics score was 1,425. So since I just got the system in, I decided to try it out on a bunch of different games that I already had installed on my external hard drive, or I guess you could say external SSD. And so here we have CSGO running on here. It is running with all of the lowest graphics settings. That's pretty much how I normally end up running the game. Of course, I don't have access to Counter-Strike 2 yet. I can't really tell you how that performs. But while running through CSGO, I was able to get a pretty fantastic FPS average with 1% lows that were well above 60, which means we are getting an absolutely perfect experience here. And it really seems to be these esports shooters where this system really starts to thrive. Because as you can see here in Rainbow Six Siege running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset, we are just getting slightly under 100 FPS average, and our 1% lows are so close to our averages that it means we are getting an absolutely rock solid and perfectly smooth gaming experience. This is really where that extra TDP is actually coming in handy, as you can see that we are utilizing a lot of that extra power, and it really is going into the CPU itself, clocking at such a high clock speed. Of course, another area that really seems to shine beautifully on this system is playing older titles at higher graphics settings. Here we have BioShock Infinite running with the very high graphics preset, and with the built-in benchmark we get an FPS average of 57 and a 1% low of 42, which means that if you're willing to mess around with individual settings, you can definitely get a 60 FPS average, and you're practically going to be maxed out in terms of the graphics settings that you're using here, which means that for the entirety of the BioShock franchise, you're going to be able to play it at its maximum graphics settings and get a fantastic gaming experience out of this. And continuing by looking at another older title that I actually still very frequently end up playing, we have Company of Heroes 2 here running with the built-in benchmark, where we do get an FPS average of 54 at a 1% low of 30. Real-time strategy games tend to be the ones that really bring out the weaknesses in these APUs, and this game itself does show some limitations to the hardware that we have going on here. Though while actually playing the game, I found it to still be more than reasonable in terms of the playing experience. And what really exemplifies the point that I am trying to make here is with Grid 2, you can see I'm running with the high graphics preset, and we're able to get a above 100 FPS average. And really the biggest thing that I'm finding with this system so far has been the fact that the 1% lows end up being pretty fantastic. They usually end up being very close to our FPS average, which means that we're getting a very consistent experience, which is really the most ideal scenario. You want to have your 1% lows to be as close as your average as possible, because that means that there is no real deviation in terms of your FPS. You don't want fluctuating FPS, you want things to be as consistent as possible, and this is delivering in a lot of these older titles with higher graphics settings. And here you can see a old school title called Hard to Reset running with its built-in benchmark at the ultra graphics settings, and again well above 60 FPS average. Our 1% lows only slightly under that, and overall it is a rock solid experience. Pay attention to those frame times. Everything is looking fantastic, and of course I ran this one because it is a DirectX 9 game, so it does show that in older titles we are still going to be performing really well. And that does mean that all of the different types of games that you would actually want to play on a system like this, for example, here is Left 4 Dead 2, a game that I would more than happily play on this system, pretty much running on what it defaulted to be its base configuration. The only thing that I adjusted was that I brought down the anti-aliasing because it wanted to go for 4x. I pretty much just set it to off, but everything else is pretty much just a mix of high and medium graphics settings. In general, it doesn't really matter because the level of performance that we get out of this game means that everything is absolutely perfect, and we have the headroom to pretty much turn everything up to the max if we wanted to. I just really don't see why you would want to do that. The way that it's currently running right now feels absolutely fantastic, and I really don't see a reason to impact the level of performance. Left 4 Dead 2 is really one of those games that, thanks to its wide assortment of different custom maps, still has a lot of life left in it, and the fact that it runs on hardware that is this low end, this budget friendly, is just really nice to see. Of course, not all older titles run on the Source engine, as you can see here by the Metro Last Light built-in benchmark. We are running at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we're still not hitting a 60 FPS average, though we are very close to it. We aren't hitting it. This is a very demanding game from its era, and even to this day, it still looks pretty great, but does seem to require a lot out of integrated graphics. So even with the lowest in-game graphics settings, don't go in expecting a consistent above 60 FPS average, but it does do a pretty great job overall. I just look forward to the day that I can actually get a system with integrated graphics that will let me turn up some of the graphics settings in this game. We're certainly getting there. Of course, the next game we're taking a look at is Shadow of Mordor, running with the built-in benchmark, and that ends up giving us a FPS average of exactly 60 and 1% lows of 49, which means although we're not getting a high refresh rate gaming experience, we're getting a very, very consistent one, though we are running this at the lowest in-game graphics settings. Of course, for a more modern release, here is Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we don't quite get a 60 FPS average here. We are slightly below that, and our 1% lows are just slightly above 30, which means that though it is a passable experience, it's not exactly going to be perfect. You can see that this is another one of those built-in benchmarks that ends up pushing the power quite a bit, though we aren't exactly maxing out that 54 watt TDP. It makes sense. Again, the GPU is reaching its maximum clock speed. It's not going to need any more power than what it's already using, and the rest really just comes down to the CPU. And of course, the fact that the GPU is going to be the biggest limiting factor just really plays into the fact that this system seems to excel really, really well at these older titles, as you can see here with Resident Evil 5 running with the highest in-game graphics settings, and we're even using 8 times anti-aliasing, and we're still getting an above 60 FPS average with 1% lows. They're just one frame under 60, which means that not only is it very, very close to PS average, which means that everything is extremely consistent, that does mean that everything is also going to be buttery smooth. It's pretty much the most ideal scenario, and the 8 times AA does make everything look extremely sharp. And it is a great result to see in comparison to playing newer titles at their absolute bare minimum graphics settings. Of course, you're welcome to push newer titles to their absolute limit, running them at their lowest settings, but as you can see here with Sleeping Dogs at the medium in-game graphics settings, you can get some nice visuals on some older titles that still hold up in terms of gameplay and story, while also getting a higher FPS gaming experience. Of course, a title like Sleeping Dogs, if you push all the way to its high graphics settings, will end up giving you a below 60 FPS average, but medium is still more than adequate here. And of course, for the meme here, we have Strange Brigade, another title that I test very frequently because of its built-in benchmark, and also the fact that it has mostly lived its life as a game that YouTubers use as a benchmark and nothing more. Though I definitely recommend playing the game. It is actually a fun game to play. A lot of people just seem to really only think about it as a benchmark. It does help that it has both a Vulkan and DirectX 12 mode. I do use the DirectX 12 for testing, and what you see here is that although we aren't getting an above 60 FPS average, the frame times are very, very nice, and our 1% lows are very close to our average, which means that we do get a very rock solid, consistent experience. Of course, for the exact opposite end of the spectrum, here we have Ghost Recon Wildlands running with the built-in benchmark at the lowest in-game graphics settings. This really has always been one of those titles that just seem to absolutely bring any of these APUs to their knees. They all seem to struggle to give us anywhere near a playable experience in this game, and this is no different with an FPS average of 37 and 1% lows of 22, which means that the overall experience of actually playing this is going to feel pretty awful. Of course, a title that I like to keep in rotation a lot because it just seems to really play well with most systems. We have Alien Isolation running with the built-in benchmark, and we are at the ultra graphic settings. You can see that our FPS average is pretty much at 60, with our 1% lows being at 44, which means that they are at least consistent enough that the overall experience of playing this game is going to be rock solid at the full 1080p resolution. We're able to play it at ultra, and we're getting a 60 FPS gaming experience. Now, it's not completely rock solid because the 1% lows do drop below that, but not by a significant margin, and you will see throughout the built-in benchmark that the frame times are very smooth and consistent throughout almost the entirety of it, which means that while you're actually playing the game, everything is going to feel rock solid and super, super smooth. Of course, I wanted to push the system a little bit more, so here we have Batman Arkham Origins running with the built-in benchmark, and this is using the maxed out graphics settings. So that's with all of the DirectX 11 enhancements enabled, and we end up getting some pretty amazing levels of performance here. And what's funny is that the final score actually ended up being pretty much identical to the score that we got in Alien Isolation. So a 59 FPS average with 1% lows at 44. So again, another situation where while you're actually playing the game, it's going to feel like pretty much a rock solid 60 FPS experience, though with the 1% lows being in the mid 40s, it pretty much means that there are going to be the occasional drops here and there, but it's not going to be anything drastic. And the last game that I tested out was Batman Arkham Knight, here running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution. And of course, the FPS average that we're getting here is at least above 30. There are 1% lows are only just above that 30 FPS mark. But this does mean that the overall experience is very consistent. And as you'll see throughout the benchmark running, it's those frame times that end up being the big winners here. The lack of any spikes or any fluctuations in that pretty much means that we're going to have a very nice and consistent experience. That so far has been the thing that I've been finding the most interesting about the system, is that because that CPU just has so much power, so much headroom to really just push things to get those really high clock speeds, our 1% lows a lot of the time end up being very close to our averages. So for my first impressions of the SER5 Max, I'm actually really impressed. The 8 cores, 16 threads in here are certainly very impressive, but that higher TDP is really the big seller here because it really lets that CPU push itself to its limit. That being said though, the uplift in terms of GPU isn't exactly massive because of the fact that at the end of the day, we're still on Vega here. We are not on RDNA. And really the biggest selling point of this system itself is that TDP and the fact that it pretty much just really lets the CPU go absolutely balls to the wall. But it's also its biggest detriment because of the fact that this system is pretty loud. When it's really being pushed, it starts to get to the point where it is just annoyingly loud in comparison to everything else going on in the room here. And I think that that's going to be a very key thing. We're of course going to look at this system in comparison to the other SER5 systems that I have, and I'm going to be doing a comprehensive guide kind of explaining to you all of the different tiers for it. So stay tuned for that, but I hope you found this first impressions of the system interesting or useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next one.